At 12:30 p.m. on December 17, 1944, Private First Class Homer Ford stood in a Belgian field with his hands raised above his head, watching SS soldiers arrange themselves in a semicircle 30 feet away. Behind him, 83 other American soldiers stood in 8 rows, their rifles and helmets piled in the snow, their breath visible in the freezing air. He had no way of knowing that in exactly 5 minutes, the machine guns would open fire, that he would be shot 3 times and left for dead in the snow, that he would lie motionless in freezing blood for 3 hours, listening to SS troops walk among the bodies shooting survivors in the head. That 43 of the 84 men standing in that field would be executed, that he would be one of 41 who survived by playing dead, while wounded Germans walked past putting bullets into American skulls, that the men who ordered and committed the massacre would be tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes, sentenced to death, and then quietly released within a decade, because the Cold War made Nazi war criminals useful allies against the Soviets. The massacre happened because of traffic, a routine convoy caught at the wrong place at the wrong time by the wrong German unit. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was moving south through Belgium on December 17, 1944, the second day of Germany's Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans didn't know they were driving directly into the path of Commander Peiper, the spearhead of the German attack. Commander Peiper was an armored battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a 29-year-old Waffen-SS officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and a documented history of war crimes on the Eastern Front. His unit consisted of 4,000 troops, 100-plus tanks and armored vehicles, and strict orders to advance west at maximum speed regardless of resistance or obstacles. Peiper's orders were explicit: maintain momentum, ignore your flanks, accept no delays. Any resistance was to be crushed immediately, any obstacle eliminated. Speed was everything. The entire German offensive depended on armored spearheads penetrating deep into Allied lines before American reserves could respond. Peiper's troops had been fighting the Soviets for 3 years. They'd learned to view enemy soldiers as targets, not human beings. They'd participated in anti-partisan operations, where prisoners were routinely shot. They'd served in a military culture that treated the Geneva Convention as a suggestion that applied to Western Europeans but not Soviets or anyone else the Reich deemed subhuman. And now they were driving west through Belgium with orders to move fast, eliminate resistance, and accept no delays from prisoners who would slow them down. Battery B had no idea they were about to drive into this. At 12:00 p.m., the American convoy, 30 trucks carrying 140 soldiers, was traveling south on the road from Malmedy to Lignouville. The route took them through a crossroads called Baugnez, 5 miles south of Malmedy. At 12:15 p.m., Commander Peiper's lead tanks reached the same crossroads traveling west. The Americans saw the German armor and immediately realized they were in trouble. These weren't scattered Wehrmacht stragglers. This was a major armored formation, and Battery B had no weapons capable of engaging tanks. The convoy tried to scatter. Some trucks attempted to turn around. Others accelerated, trying to push through before the Germans could react. A few drivers simply abandoned their vehicles and ran. It didn't matter. Peiper's tanks opened fire with main guns and machine guns. American trucks exploded or were riddled with bullets. Soldiers jumped from burning vehicles and tried to run. Most were cut down by machine gun fire within seconds. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, 20 Americans were dead, 30 had escaped into the woods, and 84 were captured, standing in the snow with their hands raised, surrendering to SS troops who had just killed their friends. Standard procedure under the Geneva Convention was clear. Disarm prisoners, move them to the rear for processing, ensure they received food, water, and medical care. Prisoners of war were non-combatants entitled to protection, but Peiper's unit was on a strict timetable. Stopping to process prisoners meant delay. Detaching troops to guard prisoners meant reducing combat strength. Sending prisoners to the rear meant diverting vehicles needed for ammunition and fuel. And Peiper's orders were explicit: accept no delays. At approximately 12:25 p.m., the 84 American prisoners were marched into a field adjacent to the crossroads. They were ordered to form 8 rows. Their weapons had already been taken, their helmets removed. They were searched for valuables, watches, rings, wallets. Some SS troops pocketed the items, others threw them in the snow. The Americans stood in the field, hands raised, waiting to be marched to a POW camp. Some were wounded from the initial engagement. Others were in shock. A few were praying. Private First Class Homer Ford was in the front row. He could see SS troops positioning 2 machine gun teams on either side of the formation. He could see officers conferring 50 yards away. He could see German tanks continuing west on the road, ignoring the prisoners entirely. Something felt wrong. Why were machine guns being positioned? Why weren't the prisoners being loaded into trucks? At 12:30 p.m., an SS officer gave an order. Both machine gun teams opened fire. The sound was overwhelming. 2 MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute into massed prisoners at 30 feet. Tracers crossed through the formation. Men screamed. Bodies jerked and fell. Ford felt impacts, 3 separate strikes, shoulder and leg and side. He went down into the snow. Around him, Americans were falling in waves, some dead before they hit the ground, others wounded and screaming. The machine gun fire continued for 90 seconds, then stopped. The field was covered with bodies. Blood spread across the snow in expanding pools. Some men were clearly dead, their bodies torn apart by multiple bullet strikes. Others were wounded, moaning, trying to crawl. The SS troops waited. This was the test. The survivors who moved, who cried out, who revealed they were still alive, those would be the next targets. Private First Class Albert Valenzy had been hit in the shoulder. The bullet had gone through muscle without hitting bone, painful but not immediately fatal. He lay face down in the snow, blood soaking his uniform, listening to wounded Americans around him crying for medics. He heard boots crunching in the snow. German voices speaking casually, almost conversationally. He kept his eyes closed and didn't move. The boots stopped next to him. A pause, then moved on. He heard a shot, then another. Systematic executions. Wounded Americans being shot in the head at point-blank range. The pattern repeated across the field. SS troops walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. Wounded men pleading for mercy were shot mid-sentence. Americans trying to crawl were shot in the back. Anyone who moved was killed. The executions took approximately 20 minutes. Individual pistol shots at irregular intervals as SS troops found and killed survivors. Then silence. The SS troops returned to their vehicles and continued west, rejoining Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. The schedule had been maintained, the delay minimized, the prisoners eliminated. In the field, 43 Americans were dead. 41 were wounded, playing dead, lying motionless in freezing blood while trying not to breathe too visibly. Homer Ford lay in the snow with 3 bullet wounds and growing hypothermia. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. He was bleeding into snow that was soaking his uniform. He couldn't move without risking being seen by German troops still visible on the road. So he lay still and tried not to die. Time became fluid. Minutes felt like hours. Ford counted his breaths, trying to stay conscious, trying not to shiver too visibly. Around him, other wounded Americans were doing the same calculation: move and risk being shot, or stay still and risk freezing to death. At approximately 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes after the initial shooting, a German patrol returned to the field. Ford heard boots approaching again. He forced himself to remain motionless despite growing panic. The Germans weren't checking for survivors this time. They were collecting weapons and equipment from the American bodies. Ford heard them searching corpses, removing watches and boots. One German soldier stood directly over Ford. A pause. Ford was certain he'd been discovered, that a bullet was coming. The German moved on. The patrol left. Silence returned. Ford waited. The other survivors waited. No one moved. The risk was too high. At approximately 2:00 p.m., Ford decided he had to risk it. He was losing blood and body temperature. Staying in the snow meant dying of hypothermia within hours. He had to move or die. He slowly turned his head, scanning the field. Most of the bodies were motionless. But a few others were also moving now, other survivors making the same decision, that freezing to death was worse than the risk of being shot. Ford pushed himself to his knees, then his feet. His leg wound made standing difficult. He swayed, almost fell, caught himself. Around him, other Americans were rising, maybe 15 men, all wounded, all covered in blood and snow. No German troops visible. The crossroads was empty. Commander Peiper had moved west, leaving the massacre site behind. The survivors looked at each other. No words. They were too shocked, too cold, too traumatized to speak. They simply started moving, limping south toward American lines, leaving 43 bodies in the snow behind them. Private First Class Albert Valenzy was among those who stood. His shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but the arm was useless. He started walking, then running despite the pain, driven by terror that German troops would return and finish what they'd started. He made it 200 yards before his legs gave out. He collapsed in a ditch and couldn't rise. Hypothermia and blood loss were shutting his body down. 2 other survivors found him and dragged him another half-mile before encountering American troops from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. The engineers initially thought the survivors were German infiltrators. The area was chaotic, with reports of German troops wearing American uniforms. The survivors were bloody, incoherent, babbling about being machine-gunned after surrendering. It sounded too horrific to be true, but more survivors kept arriving. Within 2 hours, 41 men had reached American lines, all telling the same story. SS troops had massacred prisoners at Baugnez crossroads. Bodies were still there. Wounded Americans might still be alive in the field. The engineer battalion sent a patrol to investigate. They reached the crossroads at 4:30 p.m. and found the massacre site. Bodies were scattered across the field in 8 rough rows, exactly as the survivors described. Most had been shot multiple times. Many showed evidence of execution-style head wounds delivered after the initial machine gun fire. The bodies were frozen in the positions they died, some with arms raised, others face down in the snow, a few in positions suggesting they'd been trying to crawl when the final bullet hit. American photographers documented the scene. The images would later become evidence at war crimes trials. Rows of frozen American soldiers, their blood dark against white snow, killed after surrendering. The engineers searched for survivors but found none. The wounded who couldn't walk had frozen to death in the 3 hours since the massacre. The final death toll was 43 Americans executed after surrender, plus the 20 killed in the initial engagement. Total American losses at Baugnez crossroads: 63 dead out of 140 men in Battery B. Word of the massacre spread through American units within hours. The reaction was immediate and visceral. American troops in the Ardennes had been fighting Germans for months. They developed a grudging professional respect for Wehrmacht soldiers, fellow professionals doing their jobs. Battles were fought according to accepted rules. Prisoners were taken and treated according to the Geneva Convention. The Malmedy Massacre shattered that understanding. If SS troops were executing American prisoners, then surrender was no longer safe. Raising your hands didn't guarantee survival. The rules had changed. American commanders responded with a directive that was never put in writing, but spread through unofficial channels. SS prisoners were not to be taken. Any SS troops encountered were to be shot regardless of whether they attempted to surrender. This wasn't official policy. It couldn't be. The United States was signatory to the Geneva Convention. Officially, all prisoners were to be treated humanely regardless of unit affiliation. Unofficially, SS troops started dying under circumstances that combat reports described as killed while resisting capture or shot while attempting to escape. The Malmedy Massacre created a cycle of retribution. SS troops executed American prisoners. American troops executed SS prisoners in response. Both sides justified it as retaliation for enemy war crimes. The Geneva Convention, designed to protect prisoners and civilians, collapsed in the Ardennes. By January 1945, neither side was reliably taking SS prisoners. Combat had become total. Kampfgruppe Peiper continued west for 3 more days after Malmedy. They advanced 60 miles into Allied lines, got cut off from supplies, and were surrounded by American forces near Staumont. Peiper's troops fought their way out, abandoning their vehicles and escaping on foot. They left behind destroyed tanks, dead civilians, and multiple massacre sites. Malmedy wasn't an isolated incident. American investigators would later document at least 8 separate locations where Kampfgruppe Peiper had executed prisoners. At Hansfeld, 19 American POWs executed. At Boulingen, 50-plus American POWs and Belgian civilians killed. At Lignouville, 8 American POWs shot after interrogation. At Stavelot, 130-plus Belgian civilians massacred. At Trois Ponts, 11 American POWs executed. At La Glise, multiple incidents of prisoner execution. Total documented victims of Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Ardennes offensive: approximately 350 Americans and 100-plus Belgian civilians murdered after surrender or capture. Malmedy was just the largest single incident that had survivors who could testify. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, American investigators began collecting evidence for war crimes trials. The Malmedy Massacre was high priority, well-documented, multiple survivors, clear violation of the Geneva Convention. The investigation identified the units involved. First, SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, specifically Kampfgruppe Peiper under command of SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Investigators located and arrested 74 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, including Peiper himself. They were charged with war crimes related to the murder of American prisoners at Malmedy and other locations. The trial began on May 16, 1946, at Dachau, the former concentration camp converted to a war crimes tribunal. The defendants included Peiper and 73 SS troops ranging from privates to senior officers. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Testimony from 41 American survivors, photographs of the massacre site autopsy, reports showing execution-style head wounds, documents placing the defendants at Malmedy on December 17. 1944, evidence of similar massacres at other locations. The defense argued that the killings were battlefield casualties, not executions. That American prisoners were shot while trying to escape. that SS troops were defending themselves against partisan activity and couldn't distinguish between combatants and prisoners. The testimony of survivors destroyed these arguments. Homer Ford described being shot after surrendering with hands raised, then lying in the snow listening to SS troops execute wounded Americans. Albert Valenzy testified about hearing systematic executions, individual pistol shots, as Germans walked among the bodies killing survivors. Other survivors provided consistent accounts. Machine guns opened fire on unarmed prisoners standing in formation with hands raised. After the initial shooting, SS troops executed wounded survivors at point-blank range. The defense had no credible response. The evidence was too clear, the survivors too consistent, the photographs too damning. On July 16, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. Joachim Peiper, guilty, sentenced to death by hanging. 42 other defendants, guilty, sentenced to death. 22 defendants, guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment. 8 defendants, guilty, sentenced to 20 years. 1 defendant acquitted. 73 of 74 defendants convicted. 43 sentenced to death. Justice, it seemed, would be served. Then the Cold War intervened. By 1948, American priorities had shifted. Germany was no longer the enemy, the Soviet Union was. The United States needed West Germany as an ally against communism. That meant rebuilding German military capacity. That meant recruiting former Wehrmacht officers to advise on Soviet tactics. That meant not executing too many German war criminals, because doing so would alienate the German population and complicate efforts to create a West German military aligned with NATO. American officials began reviewing the Malmedy sentences. Questions were raised about interrogation methods. Some defendants claimed they'd been coerced into confessions. Defense attorneys argued that the trial had been unfair, that evidence was obtained improperly. These claims were investigated and mostly dismissed. The convictions were based on survivor testimony and physical evidence, not coerced confessions. But the reviews created delay, and delay created political opportunity. In 1948, the U.S. Army commuted several death sentences to life imprisonment. More commutations followed in 1949 and 1950. By 1951, none of the Malmedy defendants were scheduled for execution. Joachim Peiper, the commander responsible for Kampfgruppe Peiper's actions, sentenced to death for ordering the massacre, had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in 1948. In 1951, his sentence was reduced to 35 years. In 1956, it was reduced again to time served. On December 22, 1956, Joachim Peiper was released from Landsberg prison. He had served 11 years for war crimes that killed 350+ people. He was 41 years old. He returned to civilian life in Germany, worked as a translator, and lived quietly until moving to France in 1972. The other defendants received similar treatment. By 1956, all death sentences had been commuted. By 1960, nearly all the convicted war criminals were free. The last Malmedy defendant was released in 1956, 10 years after conviction, having served roughly 1 year for every 4 Americans murdered at Baugnez crossroads. The American survivors were not consulted about these releases. They learned through newspaper reports that the men who had machine-gunned them, who had executed their friends, who had walked among the bodies shooting wounded Americans in the head, those men were free. Homer Ford, who had lain in freezing blood for 3 hours listening to executions, who carried 3 bullet wounds for the rest of his life, read in 1956 that Joachim Peiper was released. Albert Valenzy, who had played dead while SS troops walked past shooting survivors, learned that his attackers were free men living comfortable lives in Germany. The message was clear. Cold War politics mattered more than justice for 43 murdered Americans. The survivors' anger was compounded by how Germany handled the perpetrators. Peiper was never prosecuted by German courts. He wasn't required to express remorse. He didn't pay restitution to victims' families. He moved to France, bought a house in Treves, and lived under his own name. Local residents eventually learned who he was, not from German authorities, but from French researchers investigating SS war crimes. In 1976, French anti-Nazi activists began a campaign to drive Peiper out of France. They published his address. They organized protests. They sent threatening letters. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, someone firebombed Peiper's house. The building burned completely. Peiper's body was found inside, killed by smoke inhalation. He was 61 years old. French police investigated but never identified the attackers. The case remains unsolved. Some survivors of Malmedy expressed satisfaction at Peiper's death. Others felt conflicted, glad he was dead, but wishing he'd faced proper justice rather than vigilante murder. Most just felt exhausted. 32 years after the massacre, the man responsible was finally dead. But it didn't bring back the 43 Americans executed in the snow. It didn't erase the trauma of lying wounded in a Belgian field listening to friends being murdered. It was an ending, not justice, just an ending. The other perpetrators lived longer, quieter lives. Most returned to normal German society. Some became businessmen. Others worked as translators or consultants. A few wrote memoirs defending their actions. None expressed genuine remorse for Malmedy. In interviews, former SS troops would describe the massacre as a battlefield incident or claim American prisoners were shot while escaping. They maintained these lies until death. The veterans of Battery B spent decades fighting to keep the truth alive. They attended reunions. They gave interviews. They testified whenever new evidence emerged. They corrected revisionist accounts that tried to minimize the massacre or blame the victims. They also fought their own psychological battles. PTSD wasn't widely recognized in the 1940s and 1950s. Veterans suffering from nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt were told to tough it out or stop dwelling on the past. Many struggled with alcohol. Some couldn't hold jobs. A few took their own lives, deaths that wouldn't be counted among Malmedy's victims but were casualties nonetheless. Homer Ford survived until 1999. He was 77 years old. He'd carried the physical and psychological scars of Malmedy for 55 years. He never stopped talking about what happened, never let people forget. Albert Valenzy lived until 2003, age 81. He'd spent nearly 60 years remembering the sound of SS boots crunching in snow, pistol shots executing wounded Americans, the desperate calculation of playing dead while freezing to death. The last survivor of the Malmedy massacre was George Fox, who died in January 2022 at age 98. With his death, there are no living witnesses to the massacre. The story now exists only in documents, photographs, and recorded testimony. The massacre site at Baugnez Crossroads is now a memorial. A monument lists the names of the 43 Americans executed. The field where they died is preserved. Belgian caretakers maintain the site. Visitors come from around the world, American veterans, historians, tourists. They stand where Homer Ford stood with his hands raised, where the machine guns opened fire, where SS troops walked among the bodies shooting survivors. The snow still falls in December. The field still looks like a killing ground. The memorial doesn't mention that most of the perpetrators were released within a decade. It doesn't note that Joachim Peiper lived 30 years as a free man, after being convicted of war crimes. It doesn't explain how Cold War politics valued German cooperation more than justice for murdered Americans. Those are complicated truths that memorials prefer to avoid. But they're truths nonetheless. 43 Americans were executed at Malmedy on December 17, 1944. They were murdered after surrendering, killed by troops who viewed the Geneva Convention as an obstacle to be ignored when convenient. Their killers were convicted at Nuremberg, sentenced to death, then quietly released when political priorities changed. The survivors watched their attackers go free and understood a fundamental truth about justice: it's negotiable. Strategic considerations matter more than murdered soldiers. International politics trump war crimes convictions. This knowledge, that their suffering was deemed less important than Cold War alliances, broke something in the survivors that combat itself hadn't destroyed. They believed that fighting for their country meant something, that war crimes would be punished, that the system would deliver justice. Instead, they watched SS war criminals walk free while they carried bullet wounds and nightmares for the rest of their lives. Some survivors made peace with this. Others never did. All of them carried the knowledge that justice is a luxury nations provide only when it's convenient. The Malmedy Massacre is remembered as a war crime. The trials are cited as examples of Allied commitment to justice. The memorial at Baugnez honors the dead. But the full story, the releases, the commutations, the SS troops living comfortable lives while their victims suffered, that story is less often told. It's complicated. It raises uncomfortable questions about what justice means when politics intervene. It forces us to confront the gap between what we say we value and what we actually do. History prefers simpler narratives: war crime committed, perpetrators punished, justice served. The reality was messier: war crime committed, perpetrators convicted, sentences commuted, killers released, survivors betrayed. That's the truth. It's not inspirational, it's not satisfying. But it's what happened. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the uncomfortable truths history tries to forget every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. 43 Americans were executed in a Belgian field. Their killers were convicted, then freed. The survivors watched it happen and carried that betrayal for the rest of their lives. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Malmedy. Not just the massacre, but what happened after. Not just the crime, but the failure of justice that followed. The snow fell on 43 bodies in December 1944. It falls there still. And the men who pulled the triggers lived long, comfortable lives while their victims' families wondered why justice mattered less than politics. Both things are true. History, usually, is complicated like that.